afternoon, everybody. Those of you who know me will know that I've just spent a lot of years doing what I fondly refer to as my midlife crisis PhD. It took 5 years of research, 2 years of writing up, and another 1.5 years of wrangling with various peer reviewers. And I'm delighted to say it's finally done. I now have the unenviable task of trying to condense all of that into 8 minutes and 5 slides. With that constriction, I'm afraid this is the only pretty picture you're going to see. So starting off with some background, we heard a very impassioned presentation now, which I think gives you some flavor of the international debate that surrounds wildlife trade. But one of the underlying concerns for conservation is that, and really what I focused on, is that African megafauna like elephants, rhinos, and lions are threatened in various parts of the continent, and their numbers are declining, mainly as a result of poaching or illegal killing. And so trade restrictions have been proposed as a solution to the poaching problem. Not only proposed, they've been implemented. Starting with the ivory ban in 1989, the rhino horn ban in 1977, and then various progressive measures to further implement these. There's been some pushback, there's been some regulation, there's been a lot of competition around it, but it remains a highly controversial topic. And there are conflicting policy stances on trade restrictions. So with that background, I've been intrigued by this question for some time. What actually underlies these different perspectives? And what are the consequences not only of implementing different policies, but also of the conflict over the policies? So my basic research question are, what are the causes and what are the consequences of this policy conflict? So I took a step back. Initially, I was going to approach this through a rather narrow economist's lens. But once I started speaking to people, I realized this is not about economics. This is about fundamentally different worldviews, different ethical frames. There's a strong political element to this. So I ended up adopting a very interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach. And I needed to find a philosophy that accommodates that, and also accommodates Cartesian scientific approaches, but also other approaches that appeal more to emotions and other ways of viewing the world. And I found a philosophy called American pragmatism that is ideally suited to this kind of approach, and that was my philosophical grounding. So my approach was largely interdisciplinary, but underpinned by institutional theory, which again is a theoretical framework or a broader approach to theory that spans several different literatures in economics, in political science, in sociology. And then more specific frameworks that were drawn from political science and institutional economics that I found practical to apply at higher resolution. So my research was divided essentially into 2 parts. The methods for part 1, which involved a deep immersion into policy processes. So my technique was really one of participant observation, taking part in these policy processes largely through CITES, through the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, but then also domestically in South Africa through various other CITES-related processes, including a high-level panel that was formed and sat through 2020 to investigate controversial issues around the commodification of charismatic megafauna. So I attended a lot of these meetings, I analyzed documents, I then conducted a thematic analysis of things that people were saying and tried to make sense of them, and an institutional analysis as well. And that comprised my first two papers. Then the second part of it was an institutional analysis of data, for particular species. It was a mixed methods approach using both qualitative and quantitative data. And adopting two methodological approaches: process tracing, which looks at time series data and looks at processes over time without using statistical methods, and natural experiments, which are natural experiments exist where you have something that was done perhaps in one area but was not done in another area, so you've got a treatment effect that you can analyze. So the results and conclusions. So the first study, and by the way, these three papers have recently been published, and the entire thesis is about to be published as well. And I think that the three published papers appear in the I think in the document there, so you can refer to them. So the outcome of the first study, what I realized is that the conflict is largely driven by different ideas or ideologies. And I drew on some interesting literature that looked at at other issues like alcohol prohibition and how the prohibitionist movement evolved. And there's various other institutional analyses of other ideas that have evolved in history. So that literature argues that essentially there are two types of ideas that vie for attention in policy processes. There are what we call cognitive ideas, which are rational arguments about cause and effect, like X causes Y, therefore we shouldn't or shouldn't do X. But then there are also normative ideas, and these are driven by sentiments and values and emotions and ethics. And so the one is, if you like, the one set of ideas are more sort of left-brained, and the others are more right-brained. But what I found in trying to untangle this and analyze how these ideas were playing out in the arguments is that there was some conflation. And that often what you would hear was, this is not caused by a particular phenomenon, it's caused by that person or that organization or those people. And there was this division of the world into good people and bad people. And that spoke to another more interesting literature that has recently evolved around narratives and policy narratives. And Yuval Noah Harari, in his famous book *Sapiens*, argues that humans are storytelling apes, and we use stories to shape our behavior. We accumulate behind grand narratives around things that could be politics, religion, money, whatever. But we agree to certain stories, and we agree to follow those stories. And this can be brought down to specific policy levels, as with wildlife trade policy. And by disentangling these arguments that people were making and looking for themes, I was able to pull out three different stories about wildlife trade policy, which interestingly enough map to bigger stories about how the world works and how we should govern the world. And so briefly, I call these three narratives global control, decentralized conservation, and animal protection. And the global control narrative in the wildlife trade policy space is the oldest. Its genesis was in the late 1800s. And then over almost a century developed through various international conferences and meetings, but an attempt by the colonial powers at the time to control the overuse of wildlife on a grand international scale through international regulation. It only really culminated in the formation of the US Endangered Species Act and simultaneously CITES in 1973. CITES being very much influenced by the logic of the US Endangered Species Act. So there's a lot of US thinking behind the regulatory logic of CITES. But the idea behind global control is that scientists can figure out what is threatened, what is not, and then they hand over that information to legislators who pass the laws, which are then enforced. Simple. The decentralized conservation narrative pushes back against that, and it kind of emerged in Southern Africa in the 1960s with the advent of game farming and devolution of power to local communities. And what this narrative says is that the global control approach is all well and fine, but there is a tendency for it to be colonial and to impose the values of certain people in society, maybe Western values, on local people. and local people actually know best and should be allowed to manage wildlife the way they want to, whether that be through consumptive use or not. And then there's this third narrative of animal protection, which really starts to emerge in the 1970s. It's always been there in the animal welfare movement and animal rights, but there were a number of events in the 70s that really gave a lot of strength to this movement. The publication of Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, and then the move towards the ivory ban, and the interest of animal welfare organizations in conservation, and the emergence of a new approach to conservation called compassionate conservation, which also underlines the animal welfare and well-being thrust that is entering into South African policy. So the animal protection narrative sees animals as victims, and particularly individual animals, and argues that individual animals deserve better treatment, and that thinking is then infused with this approach to conservation and wildlife trade, and was very eloquently expressed in the last presentation. But CITES only allows for two policy frames: Appendix 1 listings and Appendix 2 listings, in essence. Appendix 1 listings being prohibitionist. It's a prohibitionist approach. It's to ban all international commercial trade in wild species. And Appendix 2, which regulates trade. So trade is allowed subject to a permitting process. So in essence, these two appendices encapsulate two different ideologies: the prohibitionist ideology being Appendix 1, and the enabling or sustainable use in Appendix 2. And so global control sees both of these appendices as fine. Decentralized conservation will tend to support Appendix 2, and the animal protection narrative will tend to support Appendix 1. But the animal protection narrative will appeal to the global control narrative to implement its vision of a world where there is no global international commercial trade. But what does this actually mean in practice? So I was able to interrogate probably the best data set we have of any endangered species, that being of African rhinos, black and white rhinos, going back right to the early 70s, where there is really good high-resolution data of time series and of the performance of rhinos in different African range states that did different things. So they had different institutional approaches to rhinos. Some allowed them to be hunted, some did not, some were complete bans, some were, it was only the state that was involved in rhino conservation. In other countries, there was some devolution of rights to private landholders, to local communities, to the private sector. So what were the results of my research using process tracing and natural experiments? Well, the first thing that came out very clearly, and I'm sorry I don't have the graphs to show you, but was that very clearly institutional diversity improves outcomes. So all the four most successful rhino range states all devolved the authority to manage and own rhinos to a meaningful local level, and engaged with non-state actors, the private sector or communities or NGOs, to help conserve their rhinos. In range states that didn't do that, where the government maintained complete control, they lost all their rhinos. The results are pretty stark. So the other thing is that over time, moves to decentralize and moves to enable non-state actors and local people to manage their rhinos generally produced better results than attempts to centralize. Whenever there were attempts to centralize, these tended to be resisted and backfired and led to more poaching. So most decentralized measures improve performance and vice versa. So this is a worry, because if we go back to what is happening in CITES, there are stronger incentives for centralization and trade prohibition, particularly relating to these species, within the CITES framework and those who support Appendix 1. And the precautionary principle in CITES is interpreted as being trade restrictive. So if we're uncertain, in the face of uncertainty, restrict trade. One strong conclusion I came out of this, that came out of this for me, was that this dual listing system in CITES actually creates an incredible amount of polarization and tension within the wildlife trade community. And particularly the fact that it goes to a popular vote. So at these CITES conference of the parties, species are either voted on for uplistings or downlistings. And there's almost like this two tribes vibe at CITES conferences, with the two sides really suspicious of one another and battling it out to see if they can uplist or downlist the species. It becomes a team sport. I think it's a very destructive feature of the convention. I think it's a design flaw, because when CITES members get together CITES parties get together to discuss other more technical tweaks, it's quite amicable. It's only when it goes to the vote, when it's this competition between these two ideologies, that we see this problem. So I do believe that the CITES dual appendix listing system needs to be reviewed, because I think it's a problem. I don't think it's a solution. So future research, social ecological systems approaches to wildlife policy that look more at the nuances, that look more at local interacting factors, would be a more sensible way to approach wildlife trade policy than a simplistic international listing system. And then there's definitely scope for more research on useful institutional arrangements, clever property rights arrangements, private-public partnerships, those kinds of things, because I think that's where the future of successful conservation will lie. Thanks very much.